So the next set of principles that we'll be talking about is the legal principles of taxation. As I earlier said, I said we are looking at legal principles of taxation. We are looking at the behavior of taxation whenever it interacts with the law. Okay? So the interaction between taxation and law has certain traits, behaviors, and theoretical analysis of the concept that is separate and distinct from what you find when taxation is interacting with the economy. So that's for economic principles, and so we look at the legal principles of taxation. The first legal principle of taxation, which I have identified here in my book, page 25, is that tax must be provided for by a written law, duly passed by the legislative arm or body in a sovereign state, and cannot be made by an arbitrary oral proclamation unless a written law gives discretion to this effect. Now, you know, I had earlier mentioned that the consequence of not paying tax results in a criminal offense. So in other words, tax provisions relating to tax are, criminal in nature, and so being products of criminal legislation, the requirement of the Constitution, section 36, subsection 12, provides that it must be, for any act to be a criminal offense, it must be contained in a written law. And so one of the first legal principles of taxation is that it must be written, it must be contained in a written law provided for by the legislature of that sovereign state. So that is very crucial. The second legal principles of taxation, which I have identified, is that the concept of taxation includes a mandatory obligation on designated taxpayer and not a conditional obligation. So any levy of government that is conditioned upon the happening of something, or that is conditional in nature and not mandatory, is not a tax. Alright, for it to be taxed, it must be mandatory. I cited the case of Ofegbuna versus Okongu. It's a court of appeal decision reported in 2018, LPER 45086 CA. Alright, here the court of appeal held that non-compliance with the provisions of an act or law is fatal, which is in tandem with the principle that when statute lays down a procedure for doing of a thing, only that way must be complied with. So in other words, because we have earlier said that tax must be in a written law, because it is in a written law, the follow-up principle of taxation is that it is mandatory, compulsory. Alright, and that's why we've cited Ofegbuna and Okongu, which the court of appeal has said, look, if something is contained in a written law, it must be complied with, becomes mandatory automatically. Alright, so this second principle of taxation, the legal principle of taxation, flows from the first that says that it must be writing. It must be in writing. And so the rider to that, which is the second one, is that it must be mandatory. So you don't give options. It's not optional. Tax is not optional. The third legal principle we have identified is that the tax procedure must contain fair hearing. Of course, it's a criminal offense when you fail to pay tax. So naturally, it is expected that an accused person must be allowed fair hearing under the Constitution. Section 36(1) also makes that provision. So that's why if you go through all the various tax statutes, there is provision for, it's serving the tax authorities, first serving a taxpayer a demand notice if it is in the opinion of the tax authority that taxpayer is in default of his tax. You must notify him first and give him an ultimatum to pay, and then where he fails, you take him to the appropriate quarters, which is the tax appeal tribunal in Nigeria, for him to be interrogated with respect to his tax obligation with a court order for enforcement. Okay, so there must be fair hearing in any taxation procedure. The fourth legal principle is that there must be defined periodic intervals of payment of tax. So you don't just pay anyhow. there must be defined periodic intervals. So, like VAT, when it comes to VAT, anytime you purchase the item in question or you receive the service in question, you pay. When it's personal income, is yearly. Company income, yearly. So there must be periodic intervals provided for by law. You can't just collect. Tax authorities cannot collect tax anytime they like. Periodic intervals must be provided for. So that's the fourth legal principle of taxation. Okay, and then the fifth legal principle of taxation is that a taxpayer is entitled to rely on the strict wordings of the tax statute. So any provision that is contained in a taxation legislation, a law, an act of National Assembly or law of the State House of Assembly, must be interpreted strictly in favor of the taxpayer. So if there is any mistake there that will give room for the taxpayer to escape, the position of the courts have always been, right from that common law era, is that the taxpayer must take advantage of that loophole. So it is now left for the legislature to, in the course of making tax law, ensure that all loopholes are covered. Otherwise, the legal principle of taxation is that every loophole contained in the tax statute must be interpreted in favor of a taxpayer. And at common law, the principle is simple. The House of Lords are held at a time that tax involves taking away from the citizen. And so when you have those few opportunities where the law allows government to take property away from the citizen, that citizen must be allowed every escape route possible under the statute. And so wherever there is a loophole in the tax law, the citizen is at liberty to take advantage of that loophole by relying on the strict wordings of the tax statute. For authority, we have cited the case of 7-Up Bottling Company versus Lagos State Internal Revenue Board, reported in the year 2000, Volume 3, NWLR, Part 650, at page 565. Okay? And then last but not the least, courts of law in interpreting tax statutes are under an obligation to rely on the literal rule of interpretation. Alright? Literal rule of interpretation. I think lawyers will be more familiar with this aspect. So for the canons of interpretation, the recommended interpretation principle for a tax law or a taxation statute is the literal rule of interpretation. For authority, I have cited Price versus Montmorency Canal and Railway Company, which is an English case reported in 1879, 4 appeal cases, page 197. I've also cited SA Authority versus Tax Board, reported in 1971, or NLR. Alright, and so those are the legal principles of taxation. In the next one, we'll go to chapter 4, which talks about the types of tax and types of taxpayers in Nigeria. Alright, many thanks.